computer. Okay. All right. Welcome, everyone. I think everyone knows why we're here. We're going to be talking about the framework agreement, the individual agreement, the land code, and the verification process, or no, the ratification process. So if everyone could welcome Cassandra.cadeau of the First Nations Land Management Resource Center.
Thanks, Michelle. So I've met some of you before, but I will do just a quick little intro of myself. So my name is Cassandra.cadeau. Feel free to just call me Cass. I work for the First Nations Land Management Resource Center. So my background, I come from Alderville First Nation, and a lot of my experience comes from working with Shawnee First Nation, first in the role of a project coordinator assistant, and kind of worked my way up to managing some of the projects and working on the land code development for that community. So I have lots of familiarity with what it's like on the ground to actually develop a land code and ratify it. And then I started working with the Resource Center in 2015. So I get the pleasure of working with a lot of communities throughout what we call the East region. So from Ontario right out to the East Coast. I work with a bunch of different communities who are developing their land code or have already ratified it and are implementing their land code, also known as operational. So maybe I better share my screen so you can see what I'm looking at as well. Here we go. Okay, can you see my title slide for the presentation?
Yeah.
Perfect. So I will just jump in here. So I'm just going to go over a bit of the history and explain what is the Framework Agreement on First Nation Land Management. I'm going to chat just briefly about who is the Lands Advisory Board and the Resource Center, so who I am, who I work for, and kind of what we do. And then talk about the developmental phase and what next steps your community is taking. And then just really quickly talk about the land code and briefly the framework agreement requirements. So first up, talking about the framework agreement on First Nation land management, you'll find I often refer to it just as the framework agreement. There's a lot of long titles and words that we use when dealing with government. So this is no exception to that. So in some of our material, you might see it referred to as the framework agreement or the FA. There's also a lot of acronyms used. So if I use any and somebody might not be following, please just stop me so that I can make sure everybody knows what I'm chatting about. So the framework agreement was thought up and conceived by a group of First Nations in the late 80s that were really tired and frustrated with the constraints of the Indian Act. They were missing out on big opportunities for their community and economic development, in building homes for their communities, and other types of joint ventures. And so they ventured to take a look at what could they do to get away from the constraints of the Indian Act. And they developed with Canada what's known as the Framework Agreement. So they work together on this, and the purpose of this is to recognize First Nations' inherent right to resume control over reserved lands and resources for the benefit and use of our membership, without government interference by replacing the land provisions of the Indian Act with our own First Nation made laws. So this agreement was finalized and signed by the Minister of Indian Affairs at the time and the 13 First Nations who developed it. So that was in February 1996. So Canada ratified their commitment to that by passing legislation known as the First Nations Land Management Act. And it really just spells out their roles and responsibilities to the framework agreement. And that was ratified in 1999. So this is just a bit of a visual to show exactly what that is and how that works. So the framework agreement is that guiding document up at the top. That's what the First Nations and Canada negotiated and agreed to. Since 96, we've had 5 amendments, the most recent being in 2018. And all of these amendments come from the First Nations who are signatory to it. So they're all driven by the needs of the First Nations, and it can't be unilaterally changed without the consent of the First Nations. So as I mentioned, it started out with those 13 First Nations, and as of today, there's 194 First Nations who are signatory to it now. So I already mentioned that the Government of Canada over here, they ratified their commitment to the agreement by passing the First Nations Land Management Act. And then First Nations ratify the framework agreement by developing your own land code and community approval process, so that your voting rules. And together you negotiate with Canada the individual agreement, which spells out exactly what lands you're going to be resuming control and jurisdiction over, how much operational funding you're going to be receiving to manage your lands and resources. It identifies any actual and potential environmental concerns on your reserve so that you're starting with a good knowledge base of what you're taking on. And it also identifies any of the capital and revenue dollars that Canada is holding in trust for Missinaba Cree. And then it also identifies an environmental assessment process that will apply to projects that take place on your reserve lands. So the First Nation then would hold a vote to ratify the land code. And it all comes down to your membership, whether or not the land code moves forward. So it really is a community-driven process, and nothing is finalized without the community. So once that all takes place, vote takes place, say it's approved, there is what's known as the independent verifier. They verify the process has been followed. They're kind of really hands-off. They just make sure that your land code has all the bits and pieces it needs to have, and they confirm and certify your approved land code at the end. So why is the framework agreement so important? It's the first real recognition of inherent right to manage our reserve lands and resources. It identifies that jurisdiction that's assumed by First Nations, and it includes that decision-making authority, as well as the power to design and enforce our own laws over our lands and resources. So we can really use land codes in each community to tailor what is most important to each community. And I can honestly say there is no community that has all the exact same land code and land laws and everything, because everybody's got different priorities and different things that are happening in their communities. So it really does empower each community to customize what that looks like and what your land governance looks like, and make sure that that reflects your values and your culture and your traditions. And then once the land code's ratified, so you'll be voting on 2 documents at the end of this whole process. So the land code and the individual agreement. The land management provisions of the Indian Act would no longer apply. So the minister would no longer be involved into any of the day-to-day management of your reserve lands. It's important just to note some of these points here that I've included, because we often get asked, is the framework agreement a treaty? So I just want to clear that up right from the get-go. It's not a treaty. It doesn't affect any treaty rights. It's not intended to define or prejudice any inherent rights or other rights of First Nations to control your lands or resources, and it doesn't preclude you from any other negotiations in respect of those rights. Your lands maintain reserve status under Section 9124 of the Constitution, so that doesn't change whatsoever. So they can never be sold or surrendered. And one of the key aspects of the entire framework agreement and each First Nation deciding to go this route is to ensure that all reserve lands are protected for the benefit of future generations. So the framework agreement really does provide increased protection for reserve lands. They can't be surrendered for sale. They can't be expropriated by the province. Expropriation by Canada is extremely restricted. The reserve land base can never be diminished. So say on day one, you start with 1,000 acres of having your land code in place. You can never have less than 1,000 acres. But say in, I don't know, say 10 years or so, you decide to settle a land claim and you add an additional 1,000 acres to your reserve, then you could never have less than 2,000 acres. So it really is all about protecting that reserve land for your future generations. And maintaining reserve status is mandatory, so it can't be turned into fee simple title or any other types of land tenure. As I mentioned, since 1996, over the last 20 years, we've grown from 13 First Nations to 194. One slide that I should have included in here, and I totally forgot to include, but it's pretty major, is the very first land codes to ever take place, took effect on January 1st, 2000. So it really was a beginning of a whole new era for those communities. So Georgina Island, Scugog Island, both in Ontario, and Muscadet out in Saskatchewan were the first 3 First Nations to ratify their land code and enact them. So today, out of those 194, there's 102 First Nations who have gone through developing their land code, voted on it, and have actually become operational and are implementing their land code. 3 of those communities have actually moved on to even broader self-government or treaty arrangements. And 28 out of that 102 are here in Ontario, Quebec, New Brunswick, Nova Scotia, PEI, and Newfoundland. So that's just a listing of some of the communities, just in case you're interested in ever reaching out. All the communities that work with land code have been extremely helpful to one another. It's really an open door feeling we get from each community that's really willing to share all the work that they've done to create laws or to create their admin system or their land inventory. Everybody's been very willing to share how they do it, lessons learned and all that. So there's no recreating the wheel along the way here. We have a lot of communities with a lot of experience now. This is just a map to show some of the First Nations that are developmental and operational. So this map is a little bit outdated. This is the most current one that Natural Resources Canada has prepared for us. But all the developmental communities are listed in purple there. And then all the ones listed in green have ratified their land code and are considered operational. So when a First Nation decides to ratify their land code, it means opting out of 44 sections of the Indian Act. They're all lands related sections. It doesn't affect any other sections of the Indian Act that deal with governance or membership or health or any of those types of things. So on the side here, I have those sections listed if you do feel like going to take a look, and just a really super simple description of or title of what those sections are about. So if you want any more info on that, we have a couple handouts for that as well, if anybody's interested. So the Lands Advisory Board is the political body that was created by that original group of First Nations. They're responsible for working on or proposing legislative changes to the framework agreement and the federal legislation as directed by the signatories to the framework agreement. So including your community, we take direction, or the Lands Advisory Board takes direction from each of those communities. They're also responsible for advocating for and negotiating funding with Canada on behalf of all those signatories, and then any other functions as agreed between all the signatory communities and the Lands Advisory Board. So they provide strategic direction to the Resource Center, and then that's kind of where I come in. I'm the technical support. So we really deal with a lot of the day-to-day support for all the developmental First Nations and operational communities, and of course, communities that are interested and want to know more. We provide training, resources, all kinds of support services as communities are working on their land codes. And then we also provide information to interested communities. So just moving along here to the developmental phase. This is a visual just to show what the developmental phase looks like. There's a lot more to it, but this is just a really simple breakdown of the major chunks that have to be worked on. So Misnabi is responsible for pulling together a land code, working on that, involving the membership's input in really crafting that to make it your own and make it reflect your community's values and culture and way of doing things. And then you'll also be working on what's known as a community ratification process. So it's just really the voting rules. Sorry, just brain fart moment here. And then at the same time as those things happening, over there in the orange, we've got Canada provides information to the First Nations. So basically, that means that Canada's providing all the information that they have on record for what your reserve boundaries are, which will be fairly simple since you have a new reserve land base. For some communities, it's a much more strenuous activity and can involve surveys, but I think that'll be pretty straightforward for you guys. And then they're also responsible for providing any known or potential environmental concerns on reserve, which again, I think will be a pretty straightforward thing for them to provide with your newer land base. And these things all feed into the individual agreement. So I mentioned earlier that there's an independent verifier. So their role is to review your land code and your ratification process and to make sure that those are consistent with the framework agreement. So within the framework agreement, there's a few clauses in there that say what your land code needs to address. So their job is just to make sure that you've included all the basics. And then once the land code, the ratification process, and the individual agreement are all finalized and ready to go, that's when the vote takes place and all the eligible voters of Misnabi Cree would cast their ballot, whether it's using online voting, mail-in ballots, or in-person polls. That's all still yet to be sorted out and figured out, but that vote would then take place, and if approved by your membership, then the verifier certifies your land code. So just to hit on a couple of the things that have happened so far to date, July 27th this year, your community became a signatory to the framework agreement on First Nation land management. So all that really means is that your community had expressed interest, submitted a letter of interest and filled out a form and was selected out of all the communities that had expressed their interest. And what that breaks down to meaning is that you're going to explore the option of a land code, work on a draft, engage with all the membership, and pull together all those ideas and put that into a land code and put that to the membership to see if that's the way that you guys want to go. And then in October this year, Ms. Nalby signed what's known as the Developmental Phase Funding Agreement, or DPFA. That's one of our other acronyms. So over the course of 3 years, your community will have access to $169,500 for developing your land code and having staff on hand to coordinate all of these working pieces. So as I mentioned, that DPFA, it's a three-way agreement or tripartite agreement between Missinaba Cree, Indigenous Services Canada, and the Resource Center. It's all milestone based, so there's no clawbacks or anything. And then, so one of the next steps would be to develop a work plan. So I believe Michelle's already getting her teeth dug into all that work. It's going to be really important for your community to locate if not all your members are located or you don't have enough contact information for everybody, and inform all of your eligible voters. So this really is the most important part of this whole process, is engaging with the membership and incorporating all of that input into the land code. So that's part of why we're having this session tonight, is to kind of kickstart that happening. The community ratification process. So we do have a model that we've shared with the staff there. And so that's going to be reviewed and your community is going to decide what kind of voting threshold to use. There's a couple options, but really the basic requirement is that at least 50% plus one of everybody who participates in the vote has to approve the land code for it to be ratified. There used to be some participation thresholds that were just really difficult for communities to achieve and required a lot of communities to try second and third votes, and it was just a really big challenge. So so we've kind of changed that and put that back to the communities to decide what should that look like for your community, what makes most sense. And then basically, as I mentioned already, you're going to be voting on just two documents at the end of the day, the land code and the individual agreement. So you're also going to be working on developing your land code. Great place to start would be reviewing other First Nations land codes, and Michelle's already all into this. Also reviewing the model land code. So we have a model that's been provided that takes all the best working pieces of all the other First Nations land codes across Canada. And sorry, don't know if you guys can all hear the banging. My daughter's having a heyday with her fork downstairs. But basically, this model land code is fairly general, fairly generic. So you can take that and make it your own. And I think one important piece to note just about the land code itself is Canada has zero part in reviewing it or confirming it. It is your document. It is Missinab's basic land law. So Canada has no part in looking at it or reviewing it or confirming it in any way. Canada's real involvement comes with the individual agreement, where if needed, a phase 1 environmental site assessment is done, and that just takes a look at actual and potential contamination on your reserve lands. They prepare what's known as the land description report, which just takes a look at the reserve boundaries, which again should be fairly simple. With your newer land base, you would have all that already. And then it takes a look at the operational funding amount, capital and revenue account amounts that would be transferred back to your community. And then they also provide a list of any active interests and licenses that may be existing on your reserve lands. Just quickly hitting on the Verifier. I've mentioned them a couple times. I kind of went through most of what their role is, but they're independent from Missinaba, from Canada, and from the Resource Center. They're jointly selected by Missinaba and Canada. So there's a pre-approved list of folks who are trained in this role, and then it'll be up to your community to select one of those to kind of monitor and confirm your ratification process. They'll take a look at the ratification process and land code, make sure they're consistent with the framework agreement, and then they'll monitor the vote process and make sure that you followed it properly. And if there's any sort of appeals to the vote at the end of the day, that's where the verifier role kicks in as well, is they will make any final decisions on those appeals, which isn't common. There's pretty set requirements on how an appeal is to be filed. So that's all made public. So everybody has that as well on how that works. And then the verifier is the one making those decisions. And then at the end of the day, once a land code is approved by the members, their role is to certify that land code.
Hey, Cassandra,
Yes.
we have a question from David. In the
Oh,
future, we are going to be in receipt of additional parcels of land. Will those require separate individual agreements, or will they be part of the original individual agreement when we adopt the land code as a community?
Great question. So it doesn't need to be a separate agreement. When your community receives those lands, basically what happens is you go through the regular ATR process. That doesn't change whatsoever. For the individual agreement, it's just simply an amendment is made to include those lands. So there's no separate agreements, no extra votes that have to take place, just whatever the typical ATR process is, which does involve a vote, that process still takes place and is unchanged. But as far as the individual agreement, it's pretty straightforward. I think it's just an order in council that's made, and then it's added and amended into your existing individual agreement.
Thanks, Cassandra. And thank you for the question, David.
Okay, and then just to briefly hit on what is a land code and what's in it. I won't go too in detail. We could spend several hours going right through it. But basically the model land code is broken down into about 9 parts. The beginning typically hits on all the preliminary matters like definitions, anything that helps clarify a person's understanding of how to read the land code, and where that authority to govern the land comes from. Part 2 typically looks at First Nation legislation, so what kinds of laws your First Nation will be able to develop and make. Part 3 looks at the community meetings and approvals process, so it really spells out exactly how your members have to be engaged in all the land management decisions and process, and how votes and whatnot would have to take place. Part 4 talks about protection of land. So that part really just talks about how your lands are protected. Some communities like to add a piece about, heritage sites being protected and whatnot. Some communities like to include a section about expropriation and whether or not they want their council to be able to have that ability or not. Part 5 typically looks at accountability. So that's where the financial bit is spelled out, how your lands and resources revenues have to be managed. And it also spells out that now, instead of reporting to Canada on what's being done on your lands, that accountability comes back to where it should be, is with the community. So typically we see communities require not only an audit be prepared for their membership, but also an actual annual report, and often an annual meeting to present that report on all of the lands activities that took place over the year, what land laws were developed, which ones were ratified, what's being worked on, and what's the plans for the upcoming year. Part 6 typically looks at lands and natural resources administration. So often we see clauses about sorry, my babe's calling for me. We see communities delegate a lot of the day-to-day management responsibilities from council to the staff. So it just kind of spells that out there. It identifies a lands committee that would be responsible typically for working with the community on identifying the priorities and needs, what kind of laws communities need, or the community needs, and any other kinds of votes that might need to take place relating to land, and deciding on other matters, all lands related. Section 7 typically talks about interests and licenses. So all the existing interests and licenses on your reserve lands continue as normal in accordance with their terms and conditions. Typically, that's a really big deal for folks to hear if they've had a land base and had lots of CPs or certificates of possession or anything issued, or leases. People like to hear that, you know, those things remain unchanged, nothing changes, those being in place. It also spells out some of the mortgaging options for lessees, and it also addresses sometimes who can access your lands, whether it be for members living on your land, you know, the family, immediate family of members living on your land, who has access to visit your community or drive through your community, all those kinds of things. And then part 8 talks about dispute resolution. So typically we see a process spelled out where community is able to resolve lands related disputes internally without having to use outside court systems or anything. So a lot of communities have gotten pretty creative in setting up their dispute resolution processes. And at the end of the day, when or if those are not helpful, or it hasn't helped the parties to a dispute reach a resolution, you're still able to go to court if needed. It just creates a mechanism to kind of clean the dirty laundry in the community without having to use those outside options. And then part 9 talks about other matters, just that your community would carry liability insurance, and just a couple other little housekeeping items about enforcement of your laws that fall under section 27 of the criminal code, and the environmental or people that would break your laws that are related to environment, those would carry much higher penalties. Lots of communities create lots of creative ways to enforce their laws that don't have to require any sort of fines or jail time, and they're more interested in making sure that breaking the community's laws is prevented rather than having to come after the fact to enforce. And then Appendix A is typically where we just see that land description, just the reserve boundaries included at the end there. So if anybody's interested to see what has to be included in the land code, you can take a look at the framework agreement clause 5.2, and then 5.3 also lists some additional matters that you can include. So miigwech, that's kind of my presentation for today. I don't know if anybody had more questions, but I'm free to take them now.
Thank you so much, Cassandra. So is there any questions for anyone? And just so you know that you would be able to reach out to Cassandra yourself or myself if you have any other questions, or if you're interested in any kind of documentation to help understand this, you can reach out to me at any time. All right.
Yeah, easy crowd tonight. Right on.
Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to stop the recording.